Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to introduce, first of all, the person who will introduce Ngugi. And this is going to be Caroline Elkins, who is professor of history at Harvard, in the Department of History at Harvard. She's written a book which has caused a sensation. It's got two titles, one in England, one in the United States. In America, it's called Imperial Reckoning. And in England, it's called Britain's Gulag. It's a book about the emergency in Kenya, about which, of course, Ngugi has written. His first three novels were basically about the emergency, and of course, culminating really in A Grain of Wheat. She's written this book and gone into the whole history of British repression. There's no other word for it, of the war of the insurrection in Kenya. So she knows all about Kenya, and she will introduce Ngugi to us this evening. Caroline?
Thank you, Biola, for those very kind words. I have to say it's an honor for me as an Africanist, and particularly as an historian of Kenya, to be standing here in the company of Ngugi wa Thiong'o and introducing him to you today. For those of you who attended his first two lectures and heard the various introductions, the canon of his years of literary work is well known to you, and I suspect well known to you even prior to the introductions. I'd like then, by way of introduction today, to discuss just briefly his immense importance to the study of history in Africa, and particularly to Kenya. The topic of memory, the erasure of memory, the processes of dismembering and remembering have been the main themes of his first two lectures, and for today's lecture as well. And it's here that Ngugi is, in many ways, part of the historical processes about which he's speaking. During the 1950s, the Mau Mau emergency erupted in Kenya, and it was a war fought largely by the Kikuyu people against the white and black faces of colonial rule. These were unspeakably violent times, with horrific crimes perpetrated against the Mau Mau adherents in the detention camps and emergency villages that had been set up by the British colonial government as a way of suppressing the movement. In total, nearly the entire Kikuyu population of 1.5 million people, men, women, children alike, were put into some form of detention and subject variously to torture, disease, famine, and death. And then, just prior to decolonization in 1963, the British colonial government destroyed virtually all of the documentation related to this period, some of which in massive bonfires in the streets of Nairobi. And then, to seal the silencing of memory, Jomo Kenyatta, Kenya's first president, declared that the country must forgive and forget and never speak about this part of its past ever again. The official silencing was an effort to obliterate the memory of these violent times. But Ngugi refused to heed this call. Instead, captured in his novels, as Biola pointed out, particularly Grain of Wheat, he kept the memory of Mau Mau alive through the voices and actions of his characters and prevented the past from slipping into the irretrievable abyss of silence. For such efforts, as well as others, he found himself detained in the post-colonial state of Kenya in conditions of degradation and casual cruelty not dissimilar to those of the Mau Mau times that the British colonial government and the Kenyatta and later Moi regimes so desperately tried to erase from memory. And it's because of his courage that we today, people like myself and others, are able to excavate pieces of the past as we seek to remember and understand the history of Mau Mau, the history of Kenya, and the history of Africa. So it's therefore with enormous humility that I stand here before you to introduce truly one of my longtime heroes, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, to deliver the last in his three-part lecture series for the Macmillan Stewart Lectures. Ngugi.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for the introduction, the warm words, and more important for me as a Kenyan, as an African, is the appreciation of the work you have done in your book, Imperial Reckoning, because it's one thing for fiction writers to talk about certain events. People can always dismiss that as fiction, these are work of fiction. But it's another thing when you get solid work of scholarship, which cannot even be faulted on scholarship, and therefore what she says about what was happening in Kenya has rings or is able to convince probably many more people than merely, the work, of fiction, which some of us, have been, of course, writing. This is not to say that fiction is not important. It is important, but sometimes you do need this scholarly, solid work, of scholarship to back up some conclusions about, the historical experience, of a people. Once again, I want to start by, thanking you for coming to the lectures, enduring some of the certain lengthy, talks and so on. But it'd be very important for me to, in terms of developing, the argument, so once again, I'll ask you to bear with me today because I need to develop this argument slowly, especially today when the challenge is to answer all those questions which have been delayed answering and so on. So this is a day not of imperial reckoning, but certainly of intellectual reckoning. But there are, of course, people who are here whom I like to mention, not all of them, but at least one, Cecile McHardy, who has written a performance piece called Mother Tongue. Where is she actually? Where are you? Okay, yes. And she brought me memories of George Lamming, memories of Kwame Nkrumah, and so on. So in that sense, her being here is quite an important presence in terms of what I've been trying to articulate. And whenever I go to places, I always to learn a few things. So it was wonderful to meet Reverend Moore. And when I go back to California, Irvine, I promised myself I'll be eating more vegetables, drink plenty of water, because he told me this is what has kept him so young. And so, that's and that's great. So in fact, I'll start by drinking water in appreciation of the process that has kept you so young and sort of very, kept you so well. The others who are here, from Kenya, and I really appreciate, Wambo, your presence and bringing your fellow teachers and who have been working on a project of making African literature available in schools, which is very, very important, because no matter how much we talk about these things in theory, the practice of making this literature available to the young is very, very important in terms, again, of the future memory and continuity and all that. So once again, I appreciate your presence. And lastly, let me say that with these lectures, every night when I go back to my hotel, I call my wife, Jerry, or Ngugi, to report on happenings. So she's been following the adventures here through telephone, and she says, to pass her greetings to you all. And she says, normally she accompanies me to prevent people from throwing tomatoes at me if there are any problems, but she says that she will entrust that task to you. Guys, anyway, today is my last talk on this series on the remembering, Africa, the burial and resurrection, of African memory. And remember what I said at the beginning, that these were ideas which actually came with me in the course of writing I call it the novel, or rather the novel, Wizard of the Crow, which will be published by Pantheon in August this year. So obviously I do ask each one of you to get themselves a copy and then tell 100 others to do the same. But these are the ideas that emerged in the course of writing that particular novel, which was written in the Gikuyu language, but which will be what we are getting in August is the English, translation, of the same. So today my theme is once again remembering Africa, memory, restoration, and African Renaissance. In recent years, there has been much talk, in addition to a spate of books about an African Renaissance, triggered largely by Mandela's comments at an OAU conference in Tunis in 1994, when he called for the reconstruction of a new Carthage. Thabo Mbeki, the current president of South Africa, has popularized the term in his speeches, whether to bankers, economic planners, or other leaders. The talk of Renaissance intensified following the waves of defeats of dictatorships in the 90s, among them Mobutu, Banda, Mengistu, and Siad Barre. Electoral democracy seemed on the rise. In 1994, Manthia Diawara launched a journal in New York called Black Renaissance, Renaissance Noir, and which is still going strong. But even before this, throughout the 20th century, the word Renaissance cropped up in reference to the South African Xhosa and Zulu writers of the early 20th century, among them Mkai, and later the Thiong'o brothers and Benedict Vilakazi. There's a work which is being done by Ntongela Maslela of South Africa, really monumental work on the intellectual history of South Africa. And I think when this book comes out, finally, it's really going to make us all start revising our sense of the intellectual history of Africa, although he's focusing on South Africa, but the model he develops, I think, will be applicable to many parts of Africa. On South Africa, I've taken a lot from his work. In 1949 or thereabout, Sheikh Anita Diop used the term Renaissance when he posed the conditions necessary for such an African Renaissance. And of course, there is Harlem Renaissance in the case of diaspora, in reference to the surge of black writing in Harlem of the 20s, with luminaries that included Langston Hughes, Zola Neale Hurston, Claude McKay, and Conti Carlin. The recourse to the term Renaissance to describe a moment when the quantity and quality of intellectual and artistic output is perceived to signal a monumental historical shift in the life of a people, nation, or region is not peculiar to Africa. And there has been talks of other renaissances in different histories and cultures. A forthcoming book, edited by Shudagen and Guillemon, is appropriately titled Other Renaissances, and has chapters on Arab, Bengali, Tamil, Chinese, Harlem, Mexican, Maori, Chicago, Hebrew, and Irish Renaissances, although ironically leaving out Africa, even though there has been a write-ups on Sophiatown Renaissance and on African Renaissance in general. But a very important book coming out soon. But any talk of Renaissance, of whatever kind, inevitably invites a comparison with the European Renaissance, a term coined in 19th century to refer to the Europe of 14th and 16th centuries, between the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment, but more appropriately, the beginnings of capitalist modernity. This is inevitable in the case of Africa, because European capitalist modernity, emerging out of those voyages of the body and mind, was rooted in slave trade, slavery, and colonialism. Karl Marx that is, cites the turning of Africa into a warren for the hunting of black skins alongside the entombment of the original inhabitants in the gold and silver mines of America, are signaling the rosy dawn of capitalism, a capitalism that came dripping with blood and dirt in every pore and every core. This turned Africa into the dark side of European Enlightenment, a darkness that lasted from 17th century to mid-20th century. The plunging marked a kind of break, a hiatus, if you like, in African development. That is development seen as organic working out of the internal and external contradictions in society. And it put in motion what Rodney rightly has described as development of underdevelopment. The hiatus or the break may be described correctly as African Middle Ages, meaning the entire slave and colonial period during which Africa is dismembered from its history. When European writers refer to Africa as the dark continent or wrote novels on themes of darkness, they were ironically referring to what they had created with their kind of light. It is quite insightful of Conrad to see the gate to the heart of darkness of his novel as lying in European warehouses. Thames and Brussels, according to him, were the gates into the heart of darkness of hunting down peoples on account of their color and shape of their nose. There are significant parallels between the African and European Middle Ages, besides their sharing the term Dark Ages. The European Renaissance marks the end of the European Dark Ages. The same Renaissance marks the beginnings of the African Dark Ages. If the picture of the world in the European Dark Ages was centered in God, church, and universal empire, that of Africa was centered in a white God, mother country, and colonial empires. Can we then talk meaningfully about an African Renaissance comparable to that of Europe? The general tendency is in the current talk about an African Renaissance is more of it as a desirable ideal, an outcome that can be willed into being, rather than a thing that has already happened or happening. And to a certain extent, this is true. A fully fledged Renaissance has yet to flower. Nevertheless, African Renaissance has already started. And in my view, it began at the historical moment when the idea of Africa, or the African idea, became an organizing force in opposition to the European empires. Mudibe, whom I've already referred, talks of the idea of Africa in a book of the same title as a product of the West's system of self-representation that included creation of an otherness conceived and conveyed through conflicting systems of knowledge. But I'm thinking of the idea of Africa, or more appropriately the African idea, as African self-representation, to distinguish it from Mudibe's formula as Europe finding itself through its invention of Africa. I see the African idea as that which is forged in the diaspora and traveling back to the continent. In diaspora, Africans could see the whole continent as the home they were forced to leave, no matter how they viewed their exile, as mercy in the case of Phyllis Whitley, or a tragic loss in the case of Equeno and those who sang of feeling like motherless children a long way from home. The African idea in diaspora finds its most dramatic self-realization in the independence of Haiti at the end of 18th and beginning of 19th century. In recognition of the centrality of Haiti in the African idea, C.L.I. James, in the Black Jacobins, which he published in 1938, says that he wrote it, the book that is, with Africa in mind. What the Haitians had done against plantation slavery, defeating the combined efforts of the most advanced Europeans of the day, including the expedition sent to restore slavery led by Napoleon's own brother, Africa and the entire Caribbean region could replicate in the 20th century. Césaire, Aimé Césaire that is, described Haiti as the place where negritude was born. In this context, the African idea was not simply a reaction to Europe's self-representation with Africa as its otherness, but a consciousness in emerging in organized opposition to the oppressing otherness that was Europe. It was this African idea that puts in motion the rebirth of Africa. The European Renaissance is coterminous with the emergence of modern Europe from the dark ages of a tottering feudalism and Catholic papacy. African Renaissance is conterminous with an emerging Afro-modernity from the dying colonialism of European empires. The European Renaissance launched European modernity. The African Renaissance, evolving in a struggle against the dark side of European modernity, gave birth to Afro-modernity. There are other important markers in the evolution of Afro-modernity. The 1900 Pan-African Congress in London, for instance. But it is the fact of the formation of ANC, African National Congress, in South Africa in 1912 on the continent that crystallized the African idea as an active agency in the constitution of the Afro-modern. ANC was the first modern political organization on the continent to bring Africans of different cultural ethnicities together to fight for their place in the sun or a place on which to lay their burden, to use a Garvey phrase. This momentous event was inspired by the ideas of the New Negro movement and Pan-Africanism in America, where some of its founders had interacted with persons and ideas of Alexander Cromwell, Booker T. Washington, and most important, W.B. Du Bois. Pixley Isaac Aseme, one of the founders of ANC, and who in 1904 had written an essay, The Regeneration of Africa, studied at Jesus College, Oxford, and Columbia University, USA. He was friends and corresponded with Alan Locke, the editor of the New Negro, and a very important lady, Charlotte Manya Maheke Akweke, is that correct? Yeah. Another founder member and later president of its Women's League was a student of Du Bois at Wilberforce University from 1896 to 1900, where she became friends with Nina Gomez, later Du Bois' wife. So they were visiting each other, and obviously in the course of that, discussions, of course, talks of Africa. And Mrs. Ntongela, Marcella keeps on talking that he was intrigued by this when he found that Du Bois' initial references to Africa, he always cited South Africa rather than the more obvious, West Africa and so on, and he was intrigued by this constant reference to South Africa. That's when he did research and found this, connection, at a very personal, interactive, level. Of course, later she returns to South Africa and she comes with those ideas, whatever they were, and she and her husband, who was also a student at the same Wilberforce University, help in generating some of those ideas. Not only her, Solomon Planger interacted with Du Bois in the early 1920s in Harlem. ANC was predicted on the African idea, its anthem, Nkosi Sikelere Africa, taking the entire continent as the theater of its appeal and vision. The event marks an African awakening to the practical necessity and his ability to confront European capitalist modernity in its white colonial robes. And whatever the regional modifications and specificities, all other modern political parties in the continent followed the tracks of ANC, even when some differed with it in some of its practices or visions. With some, like Malawi National Congress, Rhodesia National Congress, Uganda People's Congress, later adopting the name Congress. Others, like Nkrumah's Conventional People's Party, or Zimbabwe African National Union, Zimbabwe African People's Union, Kenya African National People's Union, Kenya African National Union, embodied the idea of a Congress of African peoples transcending ethnicities. Thus, if we were to turn around the Hegelian contention that reason as history, which is also the embodiment of freedom as such starting in the East and finding its apotheosis in the West, we can say that the African idea or African reason as the embodiment of freedom traveled from diaspora to the continent and back in a dialectical play of the ties that bind, to once again borrow the notion from Du Bois' Dusk of Dawn, in a fight to break out of the dark mantle of the night with which Europe had wrapped Africa. Du Bois' mantra of colorful lights with which he sings of Africa opposes Hegel's mantle of the night with which he wraps Africa. The African idea became the animating force of modern politics in the continent, for whether in Kenya, Nigeria, Angola, or Senegal, people view themselves as Africans. It does not, of course, mean that continental Africans began to struggle against European occupation in the beginning of the 20th century. But previously, they had fought back as Zulus, think of Zulu Wars, for instance, or East Xhosa, think of Xhosa Wars, as Ashanti, or Ikoyo, or Igbo. The qualitative difference was their self-perception as Africans. They organized themselves at the modern type political parties as Africans. Azikiwe of Nigeria, who spearheaded the Nigerian struggle, titled his book Resurgent Africa, just as Nkrumah titled his Towards African Freedom. And just as the emergence of the modern in Europe is reflected in the flowering or efflorescence in the arts, preceding it, surrounding it, and emanating from it, the 1912 moment is preceded, surrounded, then followed by a spate of important writings in South Africa, mainly in African languages, although there's a contention between English and African languages as the best means of its self-realization. And I've got a few examples, like Kai's poetry in Izwi Bantu, his novella Ilia Lamoele, Walter Benson, Zemkem Kono Magwil Ladimi, Magema Frize Abantu Abamnyama, are a few examples, which once again I got from Ntongela Masilela. But the real point, turning point, in the drama of the Afro-modernity was the 1945 Manchester Congress, that's Pan-African Congress, which, among other things, called upon the intellectuals and professional classes of the colonies to awaken to their responsibilities and join the masses to oust colonial rule. In response to that declaration to colonial peoples of the world, leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Jomo Kenyatta returned to Africa from the domiciles abroad to lead the continent out of the dark ages of colonial empire into an era of African enlightenment. The result, when we come to think of it, was really the result was the remarkable decades of the 50s and 60s of the 20th century, whose drama of change is completely unprecedented in world history. Country after country in Africa reclaimed its independence, announcing themselves as players in the modern stage, in a process reshaping the stage, the color of it at least. Each country may have emerged as a nation state territorially, but beneath their national colors, once again, they saw themselves as Africans. The journey of the African idea, beginning in Haiti, championed by Pan-African congresses, reached its climax in the independence of Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique, and in the liberation of South Africa in the 80s and 90s. Independence of African countries ushered Rio, and it's this independence that I'm seeing as ushering Rio of beginnings of African modernity. Thus, the launching of ANC in 1912 and its accession to power in 1994 in some ways frames a crucial century which witnessed the beginning of African Renaissance and the drama of Afro-modernity of which it is a part. The decade saw explosions in the arts, music, dance, and plastic arts. Most preeminent is, of course, the emergence of African writing in European language, a process that continues to this day. Thus, just as the energy, vigor, impetus of the European Renaissance in the arts was only an expression or a reflection at the aesthetic level of the energy and heat generated by the tension and contradictions in the meeting point of two epochs, the old and the new, a dying world and another struggling to be born. The same is true of Africa, where the vigor, contradictions, and tensions of decolonization were transmitted in the earth and aesthetic vibrations of the new age. To the question, Africa, tell me Africa, is this you, this back that's bent, this back breaks under the weight of humiliation, this back trembling with red scars and saying yes to the whip under the midday sun? A grave but clearly optimistic voice would answer poet David Diop, that tree there in splendid loveliness amidst white and faded flowers, that is Africa, your Africa, that grows again patiently, obstinately, and its fruit gradually acquires the bitter taste of liberty. An artist does not create tensions and conflicts in society. He or she responds to them, giving them shape, form, direction, or merely recording them. And this is true of the African artist of the 20th and 21st century, as it was of the European Renaissance artist centuries earlier. And as in the European Renaissance, which begins earlier in Quattrocento Italy and later the Western seaboard in 16th century, African Renaissance has not been uniform or drastic. It's earlier in some places, later in others. Again, like in the European Renaissance, out of which emerged the nation-states of Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, and England, say European bourgeois states, out of the African Renaissance has been the birth of many nation-states. Even the contradictions of the age are comparable in some ways. Those in its midst could view the European Renaissance as expression of both hope and hopelessness. Erasmus of Rotterdam could swing from denouncing it as a corruption. When was there ever more tyranny, he asked? When did avarice reign more larger and less punished? To lauding it as the near approach of a golden age, dawn of a new world, making him wish he could grow young again, and then back to denouncing it as irremediable confusion of everything. It was an age of massacres, most prominent among them being the St. Bartholomew massacre in Paris in 1572. It was an age of wars between and within the new nation states, England and Spain, for instance, or the 30 Years' War in Europe, or Germany in particular, between 1618 and 1648. In the same way, one could see in what is unfolding in Africa the face of Nyerere, Mandela, Kofi Annan, Soyinka, Amilcar Cabral, Agostinho Neto, Mahfouz, Bishop Tutu, Wangari Maathai, or those of Moi, Mobutu, Idi Amin, Bokassa, and so on. The face of rising democracies or reigning military and civilian dictatorships. The avarice, tyranny, and confusion that appalled Erasmus of Rotterdam applies to post-colonial Africa. Hope and hopelessness still contend for the domination of the African soul, And no doubt anybody who has traveled in Africa mostly can see the appalling gap between the wealth of a few and the appalling poverty, the gap increasing rather than decreasing, and so on. And this is the reality of Africa present. But there, the similarities end. The European Renaissance lasted 3 centuries, 4 if we include the 13th, and 5 if we include the 17th century. The African is just a century old. European Renaissance is a thing of the past. We know the kind of modernity it generated and its impact on the world. The African Renaissance is a work in progress, and we cannot predict as yet its ultimate shape, destiny, or its impact on Afro-modernity and the world. The European intellectual movement was a reflection in ideas and aesthetics of fundamental changes in the organization of the production of wealth within the womb of the feudal societies of Europe. A blooming mercantile capitalism gave, quote Marx, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never before known, and thereby to the revolutionary element in the tottering feudal society, a rapid development. The revolutionary element that Marx and Engels are talking about was, of course, the rising middle class that sought and needed freedom from the ecclesiastical laws, the closed guilds, and a view of the world that denied it movement. It is true that the African middle class that led anti-colonial nationalism wanted freedom from the colonial laws, the racial barriers, and a racialized view of the world that put whiteness at the center and denied it movement. But the nationalist class, described by Fanon in terms of pitfalls of national consciousness, did not come into the headship of the new states as an independent bourgeoisie. It was soon ensnared in neocolonialism, the Cold War politics, and globalization. It was a class with no capital, no inventors among them, no new worlds to conquer and rob, only a world in which to beg, and a nation to rob. Where during the anti-colonial struggle it saw its powers as derived from its intimate connection from the people, after independence it saw its power as derived from a cozy relationship to the Western bourgeoisie. The Pan-African vision that imaged the idealism of wholeness is gradually cut down to the size of a continent, the nation, region, ethnic groups, to the clan and the village in some instances. Without a fundamental reorganization of production and a change in its view of the sources of its power, it becomes merely an enabler of the easy flow of national resources from Africa to the West, with a lucrative commission fee for its role as a middle person. The European bourgeoisie stole from the colonies and from each other even, raiding each other's ships in the high seas. The African middle class uses the ship of state to loot the nation. Fragmented economically, its leaders pawning her resources, Africa remains the younger, poor relations of global capitalism. The European middle class had the vigor and energy of youth. The African middle class became senile, a la Africa the Frog of Koyama's novel, The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. It's used an image where, a child, someone is born, and before evening, he's gone through all the normal ages of growing up, from child to old age, before their very eyes. It's an amazing sight. And he compares the African bourgeoisie to both Fanon and Koyama. They are using a kind of image to characterize the African bourgeoisie. That is, becomes senile before it experienced the vigor and daring of youth. Because, to quote Fanon, in its early days, the national bourgeoisie of the colonial countries identifies with the last stage of Western bourgeoisie. When the Elizabeth bourgeoisie is decadent, is sort of reaches sort of, that's the bourgeoisie it is actually copying and identifies, or that the stage is identifying with, and so on. The European bourgeoisie, or Western bourgeoisie, in its youth, took charge of their own and raided others to augment their national coffers. The African bourgeoisie raids its own treasures to augment Western treasuries. This is clearest in the two groups at different attitudes to their most important heritage, languages. And Holland and I at Brevstein were talking about setting up an archive in South Africa, and he was talking to me about that he's looking at language as the biggest and primary archive. So it is a very important resource, and we shall look at briefly at the two classes, so attitudes to their most important heritage, which is language. The two salient features of the European Renaissance are discovery and recovery. By discovery, I don't mean the voyages of exploration and conquest, the creation of colonial otherness, but Europe's encounter with its own languages. Eric Auerbach, in his book Literary Language and its public in late Latin antiquity and in the Middle Ages, talks, describes European Renaissance as the movement through which the literary languages of the various European peoples finally shook off Latin. Before this, Latin had occupied a position not too dissimilar to that currently occupied by European languages in Africa today. It was, and I quote him, it was virtually the sole vehicle of intellectual and written communication, a foreign language that had to be learned, cut off from the spoken language. Overwhelmed by the all-pervasive presence of Latin, the pioneers of this shift were at first apologetic, time and again finding it necessary to answer the question, almost like Nuala in the case of her choice of Irish, why they wrote in vernacular. For Dante, in Der Vulgari Eloquentia, or the eloquence of the vernacular, of the two kinds of speech, the foreign and vernacular, he says the vernacular is a nobler, both because it is enjoyed by the whole world, though it has been divided into different languages, different words and paradigms, and because it is natural to us, while the other is more an artificial product. The vernacular is closer. He defends his choice of the Italian or Tuscan as the language of critical commentary on the basis of its being the language of his primary experience. And I quote him, "And since the better known a route is, the more safely and more quickly it may be traveled, I shall proceed only along that language which is my own, leaving aside the others." On Italian, as compared to other languages, he finds, quote, "each thing naturally desires its own self-preservation. So if the vernacular could have any desires its own, it would desire to be preserved." He rejected calls by one of his humanistic friends, Giovanni Virgilio, to abandon the limited audience of a writer in vernacular and seek learned fame and immortality as a Latin poet. In response, Dante, on why he does not write in Latin, likens his vernacular to a new who can hardly carry her udders, so filled they are with milk. And he says, I'm getting ready to milk her with skilled hands. In time, European intellectuals of nation after nation embraced their own languages with pride. By early 16th century, say 1588, Martin Luther, of course you know him because of Reformation and all that, could look to his native German and thank, and I quote, "Thank God that I hear and find my God in a German language in a way which I have not found him up to now in the Latin, Greek, or Hebrew languages, or Hebrew tongues." The attitudes to English changed from where, and since we've been talking about English, please listen to this. The attitudes to English changed from where its owners saw the language as ineloquent, raw, crude, barbarous, incapable of expressing scientific and literary thought with the precision and elegance of Latin, to where they embrace it as elegant, eloquent, capable of handling all thought, with some even starting to see it as the nation's best glory, a future to export to the world. And there's a poet, I think Daniel, who wrote this about his English now, and who in time knows whether we may export the measure of our tongue, what is his vent, and who in time knows whether we may vent the measure of our tongue to what strange shores this gain of our best glory shall be sent to enrich unknowing nations with our stores. What worlds in the yet unformed Occident may become refined with the accents that are ours. Already seeing English as playing that imperial role. And here, I must say, actually, it's quite interesting that there were some, actually, who even feared, particularly the translation of medical texts into English, first because they feared, they say that, no, English cannot handle scientific terms at all. How do you do it, you know? But some, like doctors, feared that if medical terms or knowledge is translated into vernacular, then they might lose their jobs because everybody will be a doctor unto himself. Now, allied to this discovery was their recovery of classical knowledge, literally resurrecting the ancients as companions to the present, illustrated, for instance, in Dante's choice of Virgil as his guide through the Inferno. Or, you know, like, I mean, sort of Dante's writing, of course, in Italian, but sort of in fact, he sees himself, you know, alongside Virgil and others, you know, Homer and so on, as he's a sixth in that line of the great, artists of the past, although he's writing not in Italian or Greek, but he's writing in his Italian vernacular. Or the same illustration can be found in Machiavelli's letter in 1513, explaining how the ancients were his daily companions in the writing of the Prince. On coming home in the evening, he says he'll take off his clothes, his everyday clothes, put on, and I quote, put on the robes of court and palace, and in this graver dress I enter the courts of the ancients and am welcomed by them. And there I taste the food that alone is mine and for which I was born. And there I make bold to speak to them and ask the motives of their actions, and they, in their humanity, reply to me. You know, he sees actually the actual direct conversation with, well, the dead. Good. An almost identical evocation of the ancients is to be found in Montaigne when he writes how Plutarch intrudeth himself into your work and gently reacheth thee a help, affording hand, fraught with rare embellishments and inexhaustible precious riches. Another, Holland, talks of Livius as a real living person with something to say that might be vital to the English destiny. He asked Queen Elizabeth to reach forth your gracious hand to Livius and allow him to live under your princely protection. In England, says Madison, with a wonderful book on translation as Elizabethan art, the classic of past became so vivid that it seemed to some minds almost more real than the present. Recovery from the past and the cooping of knowledge from contemporaries, this becomes a passion, a duty to one's own language. It is the art of translation which largely makes recovery possible, and the world of the ancients part of the present of the European Renaissance. Indeed, the impact of translations on the development of European languages and cultures is enormous, both in the broad cultural sense as imitation and emulation, and in narrow linguistic sense, where translation becomes an art of naturalizing the ancients such that they become speakers of modern European languages, or as if the ancient texts were written in the modern. Martin Luther's translation of the Bible was seen as having made the modern German. I have a colleague at University of California, J. Newman, who writes of German language that sprang after Luther. She writes about the German language society that sprang after Luther, and they look back to him a century later as the one who had planted sweetness, dignity, and suppleness to our language. Talking about his incentive for translating the Bible in English, William Tyndale has sentiments similar to Luther's in relation to English. I had perceived by experience how that it was impossible to establish the lay people in any truth except the scripture were plainly laid before their eyes in their mother tongue, that they might see the process, order, and meaning of the text. Through translations, both men introduced their mother tongues into the community, of holy languages. Reformation as a whole could be seen as that which brought the various European languages in a family of holy languages of Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. For each of these languages could now lead the nationals directly to God. God understood the vernacular. In fact, when they look back to the Adamic language, that's the whole debate, they see that language now, Adamic language, as the original vernacular. Translations were not only from Latin and Greek, but also from other European languages. In England, where the nation, according to Madison, had grown conscious of its cultural inferiority to the continent, it suddenly, and I quote him, it suddenly burned with a desire to excel its rivals in letters as well as in ships and gold. English and translations were the means of effecting the desired excellence. I quote him again, the translator's work was an act of patriotism. He too, as well as the voyager and merchant, could do some good for his country. He believed that foreign books were just as important for England's destiny as discoveries of her seamen, and he brought them into his native speech with all the enthusiasm of conquest. It is in this way, through original productions and translations, the vernaculars grew And though they had met with resistance initially, the kind we see in Africa today, by the end of the 16th century, their victorious emergence from the shadow of Latin was complete. The exuberance of language that you find in Rabelais, booze, and all that, Shakespeare, Cervantes, comes from writers who have discovered the limitless expressive powers of their language. Writers reveling in the possibility they see in their rediscovered tongues. In their journey of emancipation, the languages had moved from diffidence, imitation, emulation, to self-confident readiness to suppress and subjugate other tongues and cultures. The "I gave you language" line in Prospero's admonition to Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest comes from that confident climax of the European Renaissance, a climax which, unfortunately, was also the beginning of Africa's dismemberment. But no Renaissance, however, can replicate all the aspects of another. But all others must contain the central idea of rebirth and the spring of a new vision of being. Remembering Africa is the only way of ensuring Africa's own full rebirth from the dark ages into which it was plunged by European Renaissance, Enlightenment, and modernity. The success of such a Renaissance depends on the commitment and ability of Africa to remember itself, guided by the great remembering visions of Pan-Africanism. This idea has already served Africa well, inspiring as it has done Afro-modernity. But, unfortunately, it is a flawed modernity, for, among other things, it has meant several nation-states founded on colonial boundaries which perpetuate the Berlin-based divisions, which in turn has meant that even people of the same language, culture, and history continue being citizens of different states. And these states often erect insurmountable barriers in the movement of peoples, goods, businesses, and services. But Pan-Africanism has not outlived its mission. Seen as an economic, political, cultural, and psychological remembering vision, it should continue to guide remembering practices. Economic Pan-Africanism will translate into a network of communications, air, sea, land, telephone, internet, that is intra-continent movements of peoples, goods, businesses, and services. Africa becomes a power bloc able to negotiate on equal basis with all other global economies. But this is impossible without a powerful political unions as championed by Kwame Nkrumah. Pan-Africanism has to translate into a United States of Africa with the African Union transformed from a union of African heads of state into a genuine union of African peoples. Political Pan-Africanism should make the continent a base where African peoples, meaning the continentals and people of African descent, can feel truly at home, a realization of the Garveyite vision of Africa for the Africans at home and abroad. Such an Africa would be a secure base where all peoples of African descent can feel inspired to visit, invest, and even live if they so want. But we are still miles away from this. Instead, unfortunately, famine, massacres, denial of rights, insecurity, intolerance, a replica of colonial times, has resulted in virtually each African state hosting refugees from its neighbors and flight of citizens from the continent altogether. The much talked about brain drain. and to, in a sense, give the pathos of this. Wole Soyinka, we met with Soyinka sometime in not in Bali, but in Italy, a year or two ago. And in chatting, he was telling me about the is Abuja not Abacha, dictatorship in Nigeria, and apparently these dictators Abacha's dream. You know, there was a period when Wole Soyinka was sentenced to death in his absence. Yeah, apparently Abacha's dream and ambition was to be the first head of state in history to hang a Nobel Prize winner. I mean, this sort of can tell you sort of weird. But anyway, in the sense in which I'm talking about it, African Renaissance means first and foremost the economic and political recovery of its power as enshrined in the vision of Pan-Africanism. But this can only be brought about effectively by a collective self-confidence enabled by the resurrection of African memory, which in turn calls for a fundamental change on the part of the African bourgeoisie, the governments, and the African intellectual community as a whole towards African languages. Diasporic African communities must try. I was asking this question, so here are some of my answers now. Diasporic African communities must try and add an African language to their cultural arsenal. In other words, simply without abandoning their mother tongues of what they speak, English, French, or whatever it is, because they were born into that language and so on. But if you are to choose another language, that language should be African. So you get, say, an African American, he has English, or Ebonics. In addition, he has Yoruba or Zulu or Kiswahili, whatever language he may feel comfortable in. For though the diaspora has now new mother tongues, his attempts to reach out to his African memory can only be strengthened by making efforts to learn an African language. In so doing, he or she would be connecting himself or herself to the means or the memory that has sustained him for so long in his struggles to find himself in a world that constantly puts barriers in his way. But the challenge is primarily to those on the continent to produce 4 African languages in African languages, because language is the basic remembering practice behind all remembering intellectual and literary movements from negritude to Afrocentrism. There has, in fact, been an unbroken tradition of writing in African languages that goes all the way back to Timbuktu in 12th century and even earlier in Egypt, and it continues in the present. Mazizi Kunene, who even in exile in London continued to write in Zulu, can trace his literary ancestry in an unbroken line back to the oral poet or Mbongi or the Shaka court of 19th century. Even when European languages began to seduce the minds of African graduates of colonial and missionary schools, there were some among them who argued against the seduction. Such was the case I've mentioned already of Mkai, who at the dawn of the 20th century argued for African languages against those South African intellectuals who thought that English was the best means of experiencing the modern. I've already mentioned Masilena's work on the intellectual history of South Africa, but in this work he places Mkai's work at the center of the early phases of the genesis of African modernity. His unyielding stand on the historic question of whether the English language or the African languages should be the instrument of representation in modernity defined in many ways the literary issue of South African modernity in the 20th century, writes in Tongela Masleda. He practiced practiced what he argued out in theory and wrote in his causa, generating what some intellectuals even then gave the name of Renaissance. They praised him for standing up for our language, and by pen and word of mouth recreated a Renaissance in our literature. In the continent as a whole, the anti-colonial resistance that climaxed in the emergence of several independent states also generated and in turn was reflected in a plethora of poems, songs, and newspapers in African languages. In Kenya, all these were banned by the colonial state, with some of the writers killed, like Stanley Kageka, imprisoned like Karawa Wanjao, or exiled like Henry Muria. Swahili literature in East Africa has an unbroken line from Muyaka to Ablatif Abdallah. What happens, therefore, in the 50s of the 20th century, with the dawn of independence, when under the neo-colonial context of that independence, Europhone writing came to be assumed to be the norm, is therefore clearly a deviation from that veritable tradition. I've used, by the way, sometimes I use the word neo-colonial in relation to the cultural production in Africa. And I mean by this very, very simple. You look at the economic arrangement in the neo-colonial or even the colonial practice. We produce coffee, okay, in Africa, or tea. That tea or coffee processed in London or Paris or wherever, or America, is sold to us as a finished product at a price dictated by those who are exporting it back. So they dictate the price of its reception and the price of its export and so on. Now, so raw material from Africa to Europe back as finished products, which we buy at a certain price. Now, let's be fair as literary intellectuals. When I draw material from Gikuyu history and put in English and then send to an English publisher abroad, he publishes that material, and then that material is exported as finished books into Africa. And this is what actually happened in the late 50s with the work of Heinemann, although I'm not saying that Heinemann was consciously saying so, but I'm saying the reality, the objective reality of that process is that they got books, material drawn from African experience, published in London, and then actually sold back to the continent. So those publishing houses were not actually publishing African books for the European market at all. They were publishing those for the African market, And there's an illusion sometimes we have that African books were sold in millions or whatever in Europe. No. Our books always sold more in our individual countries, whether Nigeria, Ghana, or Africa as a whole. The rest is, but you can see the neo-colonial part I'm talking about, looking at it, objectively. But that deviation, of course, became now normalized as somehow or other what is really African literature. But remember that African languages and literature are not dead, have never really died. It's only that the house they have built was taken over by European languages who talk as if African languages are corpses that will not rise from the dead to claim their house. The deviation, like the Anglophonic in Irish literature, has taken on the mantle and identity of African literature. But this claim has not been without a challenge, the most celebrated being that of Obiwali in the 60s, when he wrote in translation number 10, translation which is now housed here, that Europhone African literature was coming to a dead end. that it was ridiculous to think of literature written by Africans in non-African languages as African literature, as it would be to talk of writing in Yoruba by Frenchmen as French literature. The most popular of my own non-fiction work is Decolonizing the Mind, which continued the same theme. As a result of those challenges and the ensuing debates about the identity of that division and memory barrier, there are indications of a return to the venerable tradition of Mkai, Fagunwa, Gakara, Mazizi Kunene, and Ablatif Abdallah, a visible movement of African languages claiming back the title and ownership of the house they built. Intellectuals and governments alike are beginning to pay attention, not as much as we would like, but still some attention. And I'll give you a few examples. In the year 2000, a number of African scholars and writers met in Eritrea, and they came up with Asmara Declaration on African languages and literatures, and you can find it online, by the way, which begins its 10 points by calling on African languages to take on the duty, challenge, and responsibility of speaking for the continent. It then goes on to list 9 other musts, which include the recognition of the vitality, equality, and diversity of African languages as a basis for the future empowerment of African peoples, the necessity of communication among African languages, and their development at all the levels of the schooling system, the promotion of research, science, and technology in African languages, the necessity of democracy and gender equality in the development of African languages, and concludes with emphasizing that African languages are essential for the decolonization of the African minds and for the African Renaissance. The declarations called upon all African states, OAU, the United Nations, and all international organizations that serve Africa to join the effort for recognition and support of African languages, with the declaration as a basis for new policies. The declaration has been translated into several African languages and was the basis of the BUA follow-up conference in Pretoria, South Africa in the year 2003. Some African governments, principally South Africa, Eritrea, Mali, are grappling with the reality of multiple languages and try to come up with positions. Most are still vague about it. But recently, actually this year, in the 6th ordinary session at Khartoum, the African Union, success to OAU, underlined the importance of African languages as instrumental tools for education, culture, development, and progress by deciding to establish an African Academy for Languages as a special office of the Union seated in Bamako, the capital of Mali. In the same 6th ordinary session in Khartoum, the Union decided to declare 2006 the Year of African Languages. These are important symbolic steps in the right direction, but it's worth noting that in its previous life as OAU, the organization had a cultural charter that lauded the centrality of African languages in modernization. But this always remained on paper. One hopes that the current declaration will move out of paper onto the ground, and that all years, and not just 2006, will become years of African languages. But now comes the question which you have been asking. How do 1,000 tongues, barely mutually comprehensible among themselves, nationally and continentally, speak for a continent? Would Africa not become a house of Babel? Would the multiplicity of African languages within and between states not merely exacerbate the fragmentation of the continent? And in a continent where post-independence has seen wars of secession in Nigeria, Somalia, Congo, Ethiopia, this possibility genuinely triggers a nightmare. But it is important to also remember that those civil wars were not fought on language lines alone. In the case of Somalia, with a common language in history, the many languages argument is an absurdity. But even if this were true, the multiplicity of languages would not make the case any worse or better than in the case of multiplicity of languages in Asia and Europe. Still, the fear of exacerbating divisions along language lines is obviously genuine. But the answer is not to continue burying African and the means of African memory under the Europhonic practice of the Europhonic paradise of fools. The answer, as it was in the case of Renaissance Europe, and also as noted in point 9 of the Asmara Declaration, lies in translation. Translation, despite its bad name in Platonic dialogues, where the name of Ham, the god who invented language and speech, is said to signify being an interpreter or a messenger or a thief or a liar or a bargainer, is nevertheless at the root base of all human societies. Translation. Humans are of nature, like plants, animals, air, and yet they stand outside it as it were, act on it and reproduce themselves and give rise to processes which are clearly not identical with nature of which they are part. And yet what humans have achieved is an extension of the various aspects of nature. The most wonderful technology is an extension of the human hand. The farthest seeing telescope is an extension of the principle of the eye. So is the speediest vehicle, rockets, spaceships, for instance, an extension of the principle of the leg. Okay? And the computer, hard drives and disks with their bytes of memories, is it not an extension of the principle of the human brain? It was the translation of the language of nature into their own terms that enabled humans to cultivate nurture out of nature. Nurture is an endless reproduction of what obtains in nature, and even the word cultivate gave rise to the concept of culture as social practice. Agriculture and social culture have a common root in the notion of cultivating nature, itself a process of translation from one environment to another. In short, the humanization of nature is itself a process of translation and bespeaks of the centrality of translation in the makeup of the human community. And there's a way, of course, like these to argue, one can see the so-called Adamic language, the original vernacular. You can see all the other languages are translations from the original vernacular, the language that God is supposed to have spoken to his first creatures when he told them they must have spoken a language because they understood him and so on, So the other languages must be translations of that. And of course, translation of nature and human nurture is producing a third realm of being, what we call virtual reality, what we might call cyberture. So there's nature, nurture, and now quite clearly cyberture. It's a case of translation enabling a second Adam, and now even a third. But translation has also played crucial roles in history and religion. Marxian texts that have inspired many social revolutions were read by their authors in translations, mostly. Many words and phrases in the works of Lenin and Mao are debated in classrooms and political platforms all over the world. But most of these passionate debaters know them only in translation. And we have already seen the role of translation in the European Renaissance and the emergence of capitalist modernity. It was translation, the 95 Lutheran theses, that launched the Reformation. The Bible coming to play a significant role in the development of European languages. The Bible, in its translation, has actually played a similar role in African culture, almost the same as it played in the case of Europe. Which brings, of course, me to the irony that just as Europe suffocated and helped starve African languages, the needs of religious conversion made Europe also play also the role of helping maintain the written tradition of African languages. What they produced may have been starved of content, leaving only that which served the needs of anthropology with its then interest in static pasts, or the pen of the editorial censor, leaving untouched only that which pointed to the means of the African conversion from themselves, hoping to make them carriers of only that knowledge that negated the resistant knowledge. Still, their religious translations played a role that cannot be ignored, and they share credit in keeping alive the literary retention of African languages. Translation really is a meta-language of common speech, a language of languages, a language via which all languages can talk to one another or to each other. It is the language of conversation among languages. Translation between African languages can only cement the heritage all the languages may share. And it means that for a writer, the entire continent, with its vast language audiences, becomes his potential market. Through translations of works written directly in African languages, a shared modern heritage will emerge. But apart from helping in conversation among contemporary African languages, translation will help in the Renaissance we have been talking about in 3 other areas. And I want to mention them briefly: restoration, recovery, and a kind of recuperation, to which I now want to turn attention. Those 3 areas: restoration, recovery, and getting it from others, recovering also from other languages and cultures. As noted earlier, a lot of the intellectual production by the native keepers of memory in Africa has been in languages other than the ones of the culture of the writer's birth and upbringing. In reality, this is often an act of cultural translation from the subject memory into the dominant memory. For please think about this: an African writer is writing a novel in English, so on. The character he talks about are peasants who speak Igbo or Ikoe and so on. But in the course of the conversation in the novel, they are conversing in English language, which means in the mind of the writer, a translation process is taking place, a mental translation. But at the end of that mental translation, an original text has been lost. For we do not actually get that text in an African language. We find it as expression in a European language. So the process of writing becomes also a process of loss, continuous loss of the original text in African languages. What does it mean when an African writer writes a novel in which the peasantry and the working class are the actors? Although in real life the characters would be speaking an African language, they emerge as English, French, or Portuguese speakers. The translation, which takes place in the mind of the writer before it is in black and white on a page, results in the loss of that from which it is translated. Restoration, then, would mean translating Europhone literature and Europhone intellectual production back into the languages and cultures from which the writers have drawn. This would be helping in restoring the work to its original language and culture, almost like rescuing the original mental text from Europhone exile. And quite frankly, this would mean reversing the brain drain by ensuring that the products of that brain drain go back to build the original base. But restoration has an even bigger potential. An African writer's work could be restored to all African languages Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Sis Dangareba, Amat Aidu become a common heritage in all African languages. We are not talking about a new thing. This process has already started. Some of Wole Soyinka's plays have been translated into Yoruba. Many works by African writers have been translated into Kiswahili. And in this respect, Henry Chakavo of the East African Dictionary Publishers has led the way. The success of such restoration, however, would have to be a creative partnership of the writer, the translator, and publisher, and the government. It should be a conscious Africa-wide movement, an Africa restoration project, calling for a grand alliance of publishers, translators, and financiers and government. Since the dismemberment of the Africa into the continent and the diaspora, there has always been some talk of the right of return of the Africans or diaspora Africans. Liberia and Sierra Leone are founded on that principle, and they produce one of the greatest dissertations of the African idea, Edward Blyden. Garvey voiced the necessity of return in the early part of the 20th century. The most famous physical return was that of the great proponent of the African idea, W.B. Du Bois, whose burial home is Ghana. But the most far-reaching return would be that of the spiritual heritage that has been created by people of African descent all over the world. This return of the spirit would be effected through translations into African languages. Such a recovery in some way was begun by a Xhosa poet, J.J.R. Lolobe, when he translated Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery into East Xhosa in the 1950s. But this recovery calls for more than the translation of one text by one author. It will be a major project of the years to come. Afro-Caribbean and African-American thought translated into African languages would be a monumental spiritual return comparable in impact to that of the European recovery of their classical heritage. Delaney, Equino, Toni Morrison, Amiri Baraka, Booker T. Washington to W. Du Bois, Sheila James to George Lamming and Kamal Braithwaite, all these names and more in African languages would add to the shared heritage across the continent and diaspora. In time, translation of what's produced in diaspora will become routine, part of an ongoing remembering practice. But Africa has been, and will always be part of the world. Only that its relation to the world has been, this far, that of the donor to the West. Her human beings, her resources, and even her spiritual progress by way of African writing in European languages. We should strive to do it the other way. Have the best of the world in science, philosophy, technology, literature, translated into African languages. Africans should bring their intellectual production in the world into our native speech with all the enthusiasm of conquest. Here, in this time and age, we may want to re-examine the role of European languages, and that's a question which I've been asked, here. So this is an answer. In the past, European languages have enabled global visibility of many writers. Okay? There's no doubt about that. But they have done so through uprooting those writers from their own languages and cultures. They have enabled visibility in European languages, but invisibility in African languages. So you make visible by making them invisible in their own cultures. But given the unfortunate position that there are a few people who know any two African languages, translation between two African languages may have to go through a third party, which largely means European languages. In such a situation, we should be using European languages to enable and not to disable. To enable without disabling. If done on all these fronts, mutual exchange among African languages, recovery from the diaspora, recouping our share from the world, it will make translation an act of patriotism, a central remembering practice within the overall remembering vision of greater Pan-Africanism. One of the great sons of Africa, Ngugi, used to tell the story of a farmer who brought up an eagle among the chicken, and the eagle grew up behaving like chicken, believing it was a chicken. One day a hunter visited the farmer, and an argument ensued as to whether the eagle could remember who he was. The farmer was absolutely sure that he had turned the eagle into a chicken. The hunter asked whether he could try to revive his memory. He said, "Oh, try, go on." So confident the farmer was. On the first day, the hunter was unable to make it fly beyond the same distance that chickens are able to do. "Oh, I told you so," says the farmer. "Told you, I've turned him into a chicken." On the second day, the same disappointment came with the same disappointment with the eagle flying only a few yards and then diving downwards, earthbound. Laughs the farmer with even greater confidence, "I told you he cannot remember," says the farmer in triumph. "He is a chicken, walks like a chicken, thinks like a chicken. He will never fly away from me." The hunter, however, does not give up. On the third day, he takes it atop a hill. The hunter talks to the eagle, pointing its eye to sky, reminding him that he was a Negro. And then it happened. Looking at the limitless immensity of the blue skies above, the eagle flapped its wings, finally raised himself, and then up he soared and flew towards Azure. The African eagle can only fly with its remembered wings. Remembering Africa will bring about the flowering of the African Renaissance, and Afro-modernity will play its role in the globe on the reciprocal egalitarian basis of give and take. And this may bring about that Gaviite vision of the world being conjoined in godly love for all. Thank you. Thank you.
Can we take a few questions first?
Yeah, a few. Yeah.
A few. Just a few. Our speaker has earned his supper. Questions? No questions?
You can show the mic.
Yes, we will look and
Hi, Professor. I enjoyed you yesterday, and I came back for some more. My question is, you mentioned many African leaders, but as far as Africa destiny goes, what part, if any, from your opinion, does Tom Mboya, Patrice Lumumba, play in the destiny of Africa? Please.
Well, let me not speak particularly to individual authors, I mean writers and so on, but of course I have the greatest possible admiration for all those leaders who had the Pan-African vision, as part of their guiding principle. It's the murder of Patrice Lumumba has become I don't know how to put it here, was a momentous event in Africa. And Patrice Lumumba is actually remembered in literature. He's kind of inspiring innovation because of what he stood for, and particularly because of what happened to him, when he's killed by an international conspiracy. Quite clearly, the United States, European powers, Belgium, and others were clearly involved in the elimination of Patrice Lumumba. And you can understand why. Congo, or Zaire, has every kind of mineral needed in Western technologies. Everything from, I don't know what is not actually in the Congo, including uranium, necessary for, or some other, necessary for even the development of space technology in this country. Zaire has, or Congo has all those. But Congo, and remember Congo is also the site of the rubber firestone. Remember that, when rubber was really, again, a moving part of the, sort of industrial revolution, and remember that the rubber production in Congo is what produced all those cars that surrounded, became, or symbol, sort of dramatized Conrad in Heart of Darkness, satirized by, what is his name? I've forgotten his name, but I mentioned it.
Tom Mboya.
I'm just saying, while not discussing every particular individual, but, I'm just talking about the symbolic importance of Patrice Lumumba. And if Tom Mboya fits into that, it's important that the importance of Tom Mboya is that in terms of Kenya and other places, is that you don't simply kill your leaders. You don't kill people because you disagree with them. Let's work out our differences, whatever is the ideological perimeters within which we are working. Tom Mboya was an important Kenyan anti-colonial leader, and so on, and his death obviously did deprive Kenya, of an important voice of Kenya's, independence, and sets a tone for many other acts of disappearances that were later become the norm in Kenyan post-colonial reality. But Patrice Lumumba is bigger, obviously, he's continental, he's Pan-African because of, where he stood in relation to all the forces which are going on in Africa all the time.
Thank you. May I ask one more question?
Please, yeah.
No, why don't we, since we have a limited amount of time, why don't we let the other gentleman go first and we'll come back.
That means I'm denied?
Pardon?
That means I'm denied?
It's a very limited amount of time. I think to be
It's just a simple
To
question.
be fair to everybody in the audience, we should let the next gentleman go. You can approach him afterward and ask him individual questions.
Thank you anyhow.
It's a great pleasure to be here and to have heard your lecture. My question is, what role do you see for ancient languages in this recovery of African language? And I'm thinking of Medu Neter that the Egyptologists call hieroglyphics, the Meroitic script, which has still not really been deciphered yet completely. And I'm thinking of like the ancient language in what's now Ethiopia, Ge'ez. Also, all the manuscripts that are now being found in Mali, all those need to be translated as well. I wonder if you could talk about that aspect of the problem.
You see, once again, the real intellectual history of Africa has not been completely unearthed, and even what has been unearthed has not been translated. Like those manuscripts which in Timbuktu still lie, sort of, there are piles and piles and piles of them, So we don't know yet what they will yield when they are finally, recovered and so on. Holela was telling me this morning that he is organizing a symposium on African languages in South Africa, I think in June, to commemorate the Soweto Prize about languages, of course, and he is among the speakers he wants to bring to South Africa. Actually, is Martin Banal of the Black Athena, who apparently is writing a third volume on the role of African languages in, So, what I'm trying to say is that, of course, these languages are very important, and we must recover this knowledge, whatever it is. We have to recover it. And again, we are talking about the centrality of translation. But it's no good merely translating those texts into English, and Afrikaans. This becomes, it's actually very sad that probably all the effort which is being made is to translate them into English.
But first, as a sort of platform for later translation now into African languages, just as you said earlier.
Yeah, if it's a vision of saying, look, we can get an Igbo and Yoruba speaker who can competently translate whatever it is, then of course that as an enabling process, I have no problem myself with that process, using European language positively, but not slavishly. There's a difference between becoming enslaved and actually using your knowledge of those languages to get what's best in them to bring back your share. You remember when I was talking about the Harlem Renaissance, I was talking about even like English writers, and they actually even translated what was produced by the rival nations of France and so on. They brought that to the English language, and they saw it as no less a nobler task than, say, stealing gold from Spanish ships and so on, getting that knowledge. In the same way, I don't think African languages should be afraid of foraging into Asian languages and getting the best that is in those languages. Bring them, they become part of the heritage of Africa. In the same way, although Europe has done so much harm, but remember also in Europe, there are also very important traditions of thought and so on, and again, we want to get the best of all that into African languages, very much like those European languages. We are not afraid of going back to Greek and Latin or whatever, and getting the best of that knowledge into their languages, So I don't think our languages are part of the world, And I think an African language should be free and able to discuss the history of China, of France, discuss Hegel's philosophy, as well as, of course, African, philosophy and so on. So borrowing from Asian language is very, very important, especially because of similarities of, I was doing something, I had to mention this novel of mine, Wizard the Crow, because in that novel I've done something which I have not done in my previous works, My previous works of Weep Not Child, The River Between, A Grain of Wheat and Petals of Blood, the reference point is really, in terms of cultural confrontation or interface, between Africa and Europe. Okay? Now, in The Wizard of the Crow, written in the Kikuyu language, I found myself going to India. In fact, part of the novel is set in Madras, what they call now Chennai, in India, that part of the world where they speak Tamil. Okay? I've drawn from Taoist philosophies of China. I have mentioned Buddhism. I've become fascinated by the Indian epics of Mahabharata and Ramayana and so on, and their references to that. I found myself, of course, having touching, but briefly, on Brazil, the Caribbean islands, and sort of, as metaphors of this global reach that African languages should also be able to make part of their growth, if you like. So I'm saying all languages are part of our heritage. And the problem in the past is that we have been trained ourselves to think actually that African language, that the only heritage we can get is that which is in European languages, and by going into European languages, not getting from what is in those languages and get them into African languages. Yes?
What I have to say is a little bit of a shift from what you've been talking about, but it's been a great pleasure coming to listen to you over the past 3 days. And I'll begin by sharing just a short, quick story. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I remember growing up when I went to a high school. I went to a Catholic mission high school, and I remember one of the rules in school was that if you spoke any word in a non-English language, you'd be punished by either Cain or you have to clean some toilet somewhere, but you'd be punished really harshly, and the process is still going. And this is something that the Ministry of Education even allows schools to do, because there's this emphasis on English. So I guess my question is on two layers. One is that the people who teach us English are not the British. No one who really knows how to speak English teaches us, so the kind of English that you learn is never perfect. And so there's been, on one hand, a development of sort of a hybrid language where especially the young people in the cities speak some mix of what they know and the English that they learn in school, and they can't really express themselves well in English, nor if they go to the rural areas to their grandparents to speak to their parents and express their ideas in the original language that they know from home. So I was wondering what your opinion is on, these slang languages that are developing in the cities in Africa, and also, on the other hand, that this process is still going. The suppression of the African languages is still continuing, and the people responsible are the governments, and we still have them. And it's a generation that, got us away from colonialism, like in Zimbabwe with Mugabe, but they're the ones who are perpetuating this whole cycle. So what shall we do? What can be done now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but can I just add, there's a Kenyan who has told a similar story. Is he here, I wonder? Maybe. Can you please tell your story? Please. He's from Zimbabwe. Please tell your story of your own. And this is a young, I'm not talking of this, this could be my grand or great-grandchildren, by the way, and hear their own story. I'm talking about colonial times. They are talking about post-colonial times.
Well, my story is actually quite similar to Proud's. I also went to a Catholic high school, but I don't think that has anything to do with it. The idea was we had they'd have a rule that you don't speak English in school because it was the main language of instruction. So if you were caught speaking in another language, they had a tunic that you'd be given to wear, and it had on the back a label that you are a mother tongue speaker. Now, what happened is that the tunic was actually made of sisal fiber sackcloth, so that it was quite a shaming for us to be wearing it, and then, of course, it became the object of derision in the school. Everyone would laugh at you, and you even had diminished rights. It was a boarding school where you get punished by prefects and all that, so if you were the one wearing the sackcloth, you had diminished rights and you could get punished for lesser offenses.
Yeah. So let me just say this, the problems with colonialism is that it made what is normal abnormal. What is normal becomes abnormal, and abnormality now becomes the colonial norm. Unfortunately, the post-colonial has Africanized the abnormalities of the colonial system.
I hope everybody will join me in thanking President Ngugi, not just for today, but for the last 2 days, and also for the follow-up.
Sorry.